Okay, good morning. I'm going to share a screen with you. Okay, um, before we start, the learning today will be for the Refuah Shlema of Nadav. Get his full name. Nadav Ephraim ben Shulamit Leah. He went through 2 surgeries last night, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we pray for his Refuah Shlema. So today this is going to be the last lecture in this series. So I want to open by summarizing what we saw until now. We started by a general opening about the way halakha functions, or yes, the way it functions even without some of the institutions that we would think it requires. And then I brought a particular example, which we dealt with a few shiurim, that had to do with the issue of interest. Interest is one of the explicit prohibitions in the Torah, and we saw how throughout the generations, this explicit prohibition is dealt with in the face of economic pressures, making it almost impossible um, for Jews to be part of the world's economy without without basically finding a way to, let's say, a way to handle this prohibition. And when I say to handle this prohibition is to find a way of putting it in one way, leaving it in its place, but in another way, finding ways that we could still do things that we might have thought are a transgression of this prohibition, but we find ways to say why they are not. And the main thing that was the main vehicle that was invented for that purpose was what we called heteriska, and we saw how that heteriska was developed one generation after another until we reached what we called in our days heteriska klali, which basically allows people to act as if the prohibition doesn't exist, yet yet we find a way of structuring in such a way to say, well, the prohibition is there, but what we're doing here does not actually violate that prohibition. All of that we managed to do without having to legislate anything. Now, that might put us in an uncomfortable situation, which I will address at the end of today's shiur, but I'll just mention it now. And that is that sometimes it seems to be disingenuous. We have a certain prohibition that says explicit things, and we find the ways of maybe it's more evasive than we would like it to be. Sometimes the line between a legitimate legal device and a sham is a very fine line, and it's not clear when we actually cross it and when we don't. And we'll try to discuss that at the end of today's show. But first, I want to continue what we saw, what I began to discuss in the past two shiurim, and that is the state of halachic institutions today. And what we started to see yesterday, mainly through the Hakdama of the Rambam, the introduction to his Yad HaChazakah, was just a minute. Yes. What was the idea that there is a gradual erosion in these institutions? It wasn't a one-time thing, like the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple was a one-time event. There was a temple, then there wasn't a temple. Of course, if we look in it in a fine way, we could say, we could tell ourselves, well, even before the destruction of the temple, already things weren't going as smoothly as they should in the temple. The Kohanim were corrupt, etc., etc. So it was a process, okay, to one extent or the other. But but we could pinpoint an event that changed everything. The destruction of the temple changed everything. When it comes to halachic legislative institutions, it is not, we cannot pinpoint an event. It was a gradual deterioration of those institutions. And it started already before the destruction of the temple, when the Gemara tells us that the top institution at the time, which started, yes, so traditionally it started with Moshe Rabbeinu and then et cetera, et cetera. There were always those in charge until it got to Anshei Knesset Hagdolah, the people of the Great Assembly during the great generation of Ezra HaSofer. And then it continued onwards with the Sanhedrin throughout the days of the Second Temple. But then at a certain point, the Sanhedrin gradually felt it was losing its power with the people. And as it was losing its power, it forced itself, so to speak, into exile that started even before the destruction of the temple. So the Sanhedrin used to sit in Lishkat HaGazit on Temple Mount, but at a certain point, it realized that it cannot control the people anymore, and basically it stepped down and placed itself in the market of Yerushalayim, where it took upon itself, or it saw itself as having less authority than it had before. So that manifested itself mainly in the way it no longer enforced capital punishment. So even before the destruction of the second temple, the Sanhedrin brought itself to a place where it no longer enforced capital punishment because it saw that its connection with the people was less strong. And then later on, Yerushalayim is destroyed, and the Sanhedrin moves to Yavne, then to Usha, then to Tzipori, then again to Usha, then to Tveria, to various places. And as it moves from place to place, then at times its authority was greater than others. One of the peak days of the Sanhedrin were actually during the days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. But he realizes already during those days that it's not going to continue so. So therefore, he writes down the Mishnah. And the idea of codifying the Mishnah, well, it's an argument whether he wrote it down or compiled it as a body of recitation, meaning it wasn't necessarily written down, but it was codified as such. But that argument doesn't really matter. But the Mishnah was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in order for the next generation to take the greatness of this one and to continue, because he realized that this institution that he heads, the Sanhedrin, is not going to continue to have the power. That power is now going to not be central anymore, because the people of Israel are now dispersed all over. So the authority and the power of the halakha also must be dispersed with the people. So you would have people in Babylon, you would have people in Rome, you would have people in Alexandria, you would have people in Asia Minor, you would have people, Jewish communities in all these places that won't have ties to one center, and they'll have to have one thing from which they derive their authority, and that would be the Mishnah. But obviously, now that you have different centers in different places, you don't have one center, you cannot legislate anymore, because legislation must be such that it keeps all the people together. By the way, I'm now summarizing what we saw last week in the Rambam, 2 weeks ago. in the Rambam. So since legislation you could do only when you have one center, and now you have many centers, so obviously the centers now they judge, they teach, they lead the people, but they no longer can legislate because because one center does not necessarily cannot dictate to the others. So therefore, the power of legislation is lost. Now, um, the Romans helped that, so to speak, helped, yes, quote unquote, by not allowing, they understood after all the rebellions of the Jewish people, they understood that what is causing this rebellion is the sense of identity that the Jewish people have. And what gives them the sense of identity are these institutions at the end of the day. So they were trying to harm these institutions as much as they could. So one of the things that they tried to stop was the smicha, meaning one rabbi ordaining his disciples, his students, because once you are not ordained, you cut the chain. You don't have the power to be one of the legislators. You are just a scholar. So that also was part of what cut the power of these institutions. After the days of Rebbe, the situation in Eretz Israel becomes more and more difficult. During the days of Rebbe, by the way, it was very good because he and the emperor were very good friends. There are lots of, and his generation and probably the two generations after him were not too bad, were actually even good. Good to such an extent that in one place in the Gemara, it says that he wanted to even um, uh, uh, cancel some of the tzomot because he felt that things are getting better. But eventually things got even worse, and the center in Eretz Israel is going down while the center in Bavel is ascending. And now the center in Bavel slowly becomes the main center, but A, it's in Bavel. So it doesn't see itself as having certain authorities that the center in Eretz Israel has. And B, it is only, even though it's the biggest center and the most important one, it's not the only one. So they don't see themselves as having the authority to legislate for these two reasons. A, they're not in Eretz Israel. B, they're not the only center. So they lead the people, and the person at the head, and basically it's a triad of leaders because you have the Reish Galuta, the head of the exile, who was sort of the political figure, more of a political figure recognized by the Persian authorities of the time as the head of the Jews. And then you had the Rosh Yeshiva you had the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura and the Rosh Yeshiva of Pumbedita most of the time. Sometimes it was Nehardea and Pumbedita, but usually Sura and Pumbedita throughout the days of the Gemara, and then afterwards throughout the days of the Geonim. The rabbi at the end, at the head of these yeshivot, was called a Gaon. The reason why he was called a Gaon is because the yeshivot were called Geon Yaakov, the pride of Jacob, because that is what the people of Israel, the Jews of the time, they saw their pride in these institutions and these great institutions that transmit basically what we could see as the soul of the people, the Torah, from one generation to the other. So Geon Yaakov, the pride of Jacob, and the ones at the head of the yeshiva, he is the Gaon, the pride. So that is the yeshivot in Bavel. But now the Rambam writes, now reaches, and this is where we got 2 weeks ago, the Rambam reaches his time. Now, during the days of the Rambam, there were still Geonim in Bavel, but they were no longer as great as they were. The last great Gaon was probably Rav Saadia Gaon. We're going to say something about him in a minute. But now, during the days of the Rambam, it's not the way that it was. Now, before we reach the days of the Rambam, I want to go back a few years, 300 years before the Rambam, 300, 200, 250 years before the Rambam to the days of Rav Saadia Gaon. And during the days of Rav Saadia Gaon, then there was just a minute. Yeah. So yeah, during the days of Rav Saadia Gaon, we do find um, we're talking about he was in the early 900s. So we're talking about 10th century, the 900s. Rav Saadia Gaon becomes the head of Yeshivat Pumbedita. And it is only about 100 years ago that we find out that there was a great machloket between Rav Saadia Gaon and Rabbi Aaron HaKohen ben Meir. Who was Rabbi Aaron HaKohen ben Meir? Rabbi Aaron HaKohen ben Meir was the Gaon in Eretz Israel. So through all these centuries that there are Geonim in Bavel, there are also Geonim in Eretz Israel. There was still a yeshiva in Tveria, and that yeshiva in Tveria had a Gaon in its head as well. It was much smaller, very small yeshiva, very small center, but there was a Gaon there who had certain traditions. Now, in Bavel, the tradition was that the smicha ended, but in Eretz Israel, that wasn't the tradition. They held, the Gaon in Eretz Israel was convinced that he is a samuch ish mipi ish, and therefore he has the authority to not only judge, but even at times to legislate, which he didn't because he recognized that others won't necessarily accept his legislation, so they never legislated. But where they did feel they have the power, and one time they tried to execute it, was in regard to establishing the calendar. So we're talking about a few centuries after the calendar has been established, but now in Eretz Israel, the Gaon looks at the moon and makes his calculations and decides to have Pesach, to have Rosh Chodesh on a certain day. It was on Rosh Chodesh Kislev of it was on Rosh Chodesh Kislev of 921 of Shnat Daled Alafim Taf Reish Pei Bet that this Gaon in Eretz Israel, Ben Meir, established Rosh Chodesh on one day, and in Bavel, they took another stand that it has to be on another day. And for 2 years, from 921 until 923, the people of Israel had 2 different calendars. Now you have to understand what having 2 different calendars means. It means that they were not having Rosh Hashanah on the same day, they were not having Yom Kippur on the same day, they were not having Pesach on the same day, they were having different holidays. On the one day that in Eretz Israel they held Pesach, not only Eretz Israel and the countries that were under its authorities. So in Cairo, you had what was called Keilat Yerushalmim, that they felt that they are part of the of Eretz Israel Center. In Rome, they went according to Eretz Israel Center. So in all those places, they're having the festivals and holidays on one day. And in all the centers that are under Bavel, which is Bavel itself, and other parts of the Jewish world, they're having it on other dates. This one was one of the great machlokot between these 2 people. between within the Jewish world. And now, just a minute. Wait a minute. Okay, and there is an extract that was found in the Cairo Gniza of Elia Minetzivin, and this he writes, Shnat Tatalma Betesha Alat Beshabta. It's written in Aramaic, which was the language of the Jewish people at the time, or of the also the non-Jewish people, the people in the region. Yudbet Yad Dishnat Aralab. Biyunya Banafal Pulga. On that year, a machloket fell, Bint Yehudaya de B'Ma'arava, between the Jews who are in the west, that's Eretz Israel, Yehudaya de Bevadancha, those who are in the east, those are in Bavel, Bechushva de Eidehon, the calculation of their holidays, Yehudaya Min de Ma'arava, the Jews in the west, Avdu Rasha de Shnaton, Yoma de Tlat Beshaba, the Jews in the West had Rosh Hashanah on Tuesday, Ve'anun de B'Madanancha, and those in the East, Yoma de Chamesh Beshaba, had it on Thursday. So imagine that. You have Jews having some Jews. So in Cairo, for instance, where you had two communities, the communities of the Yerushalmim and the communities of the Bavlim. You had there in the same city some Jews having Rosh Hashanah on Tuesday, some of them Tuesday, Wednesday, some of them having it Thursday, Friday. That would have been the end of one Jewish people. And that was a real danger of yet another split within the Jewish people. And why am I saying yet another split? Because by that time, there were already plenty of splits. The biggest one was the Karaim and the Rabbanim. Today, we barely recognize that split because there are not too many Karaim today. But for centuries, the Karaim were a great community. In fact, still by the days of the Rambam, the main communities in the Middle East were Dafka the Karaites. They were more affluent. They were in many ways even more intellectual than many of the Rabbinites. So you had the Karaites, which were a great community, and you had the Rabbinites as well. Now, this could have been another split within the Rabbinites. So that would have splintered us into such groups that might have even splintered us out of existence. And Baruch Hashem, we were saved after 2 years of having this great machloket. It ended with with Eretz Israel accepting the authority of Bavel, of Rav Saadia Gaon, and it moved on from there. But that was one of the great conflicts where in Eretz Israel they felt they had a certain authority, and the rest of the Jewish world did not accept that authority. And eventually, it turned out that they really didn't have that authority. So that is the last big incident. But at the end of the day, we have here a people that are living according to a tradition that has a strong legal component to it, but who don't have a legislative body or an authoritative body that everyone could agree upon, even to interpret this this tradition. And so Am Yisrael have to go on with such a situation. So how is that happening? So here tells us the Rambam, and the Rambam is now talking about his time. Ubazman hazeh, yes, so that is the time of the Rambam. תקפו הצרות יתירות ודחקה השעה את הכל ועבדה חוכמת חכמינו ובינת נבוננו נסתרה ואין מבין ענייניהם כראוי אלא מעט במספר. So our wisdom has been lost. We can't hold on to the tradition the way we we did until now, or until a few centuries ago. ומפני זה ניערתי חוצניאני משה בן מימון הספרדי ונשענתי על הצור ברוך הוא ובינותי בכל אלו הספרים וראיתי לחבר דברים המתבררים מכל אלו החיבורים בעניין האסור והמותר, הטמא והטהור עם שאר דיני התורה. The Rambam here wants to, the best way of describing it, the Rambam here is doing again what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did in his days. The Rambam says he is doing now. He's basically taking this tradition because he understands that it's all over the place and that different people are saying different things, different people are understanding it in different ways. So says the Rambam, I want to put together one authoritative book that will be clear, that everyone could look in it and understand exactly the bottom line, the halakha, and hopefully this will be what will hold our people together in the foreseeable future. Now, did that actually happen? No, the Rambam's dream did not come true. His book did not become the book he wanted it to become. But let's read on. Kulam b'lashon, so he took בינותי וראיתי מכל אלו החיבורים בעניין האסור והמותר, הטמא והטהור. So כולם בלשון ברורה ודרך קצרה, עד שתהיה תורה שבעל פה סגולה סדורה בפי הכל. I want it to be clear in the eyes of everyone. דברים ברורים, קרובים, נכונים, על פי המשפט אשר יתבהר מכל אלו החיבורים והפירושים הנמצאים ממות רבינו הקדוש, from רבי יהודה הנשיא ועד עכשיו until now. עד שיהיו כל הדינים גלויים, לקטן ולגדול, בדין כל מצווה ומצווה, ובדין כל הדברים שתקנו חכמים ונביאים. Says the Rambam, because it's so difficult to interpret and to understand, there are so many machlokot, so to get to the bottom line of each halakha is so difficult, I made it clear, and I made it so clear so everyone will understand. And this will really help the condition of the Torah. Klalo shel davar, the general idea is, כדי שלא יהיה האדם צריך לחיבור אחר בעולם בדיני ישראל, אלא יהיה חיבור זה מקבץ את התורה שבעל פה עם התקנות והמנהגות והגזרות שנעשו ממות משה רבינו עד חיבור הגמרא, וכמו שפרשו לנו הגאונים בכל חיבוריהם שחיברו אחר הגמרא. In other words, this is going to be the final word. All the new edicts that were established and legislated from the days of Moshe until today, all the takanot, all the gzerot are all included in this one book in a clear and understood way. לפיכך קראתי שם חיבור זה משנה תורה. Therefore, I called it Mishneh Torah. What does it mean, Mishneh Torah? The second to the Torah, meaning, לפי שאדם קורא בתורה שבכתב תחילה, first one reads in the written Torah, that is the Torah, ואחר כך קורא בזה, then he reads this, and then he knows, let's see, just a minute, ואחר כך קורא בזה. And then he reads this and he asks everything. To this, that was the hope of the Rambam, his hope and dream. But then the others didn't agree. And here we have Hasagat HaRavid. The Ravid was Rabbi Avraham ben David. The Ravid, Rabbi Avraham ben David, was older than the Rambam. And he thought that the Rambam's project is quite presumptuous in the eyes of the Ravid. He says, who does he think he is? So the Rambam thinks the bottom line is what he writes, but I disagree with him. Now he says more. He doesn't even give me, he doesn't even have references. He just gave me the bottom line without referencing the source and explaining how he deducted what he did from the various sources. So said the Ravid, if I, as a scholar, I want to trace the Rambam's decision-making, I'm not able to do it. So not only did the Rambam not help me, but it's not, what am I to do with that book? So says the Ravid like this, ויודע ממנו, אמר אברהם, סבר לתקן ולא תיקן. Says the Ravid, the Rambam is trying to fix, but he is not fixing. כי הוא עזב דרך כל המחברים אשר היו לפניו. He basically left the way that of all other those who of all other authors that were before him. They would bring proof, they would reference what they say. They would bring things in the name of the source. And that would be helpful, because if someone is sitting in court and he thinks the halacha is A or B, then he sees someone else wrote something else, and that person who wrote something else is quoting a source or explaining why he reached that decision, then that is helpful to the dayan. But if he doesn't know where he knows it from, it's not helpful. It's just someone else says something else. So the Rambam thinks otherwise. What do I care? If he didn't bring a source, if he didn't reference it, what is it to me, says the Ravid. But now he doesn't know. Says the Ravid, excuse me, but I don't see you as an authority, Rambam. You're a great Talmid Chacham, but so am I, says the Ravid. So excuse me, I don't see you as an authority. If you reference what you say, then we might have an argument. But if you don't, then it's useless for me, says the Ravid. אם החולק עליי גדול ממני, הרי טוב, ואם אני גדול ממנו, למה אבטל דעתי מפני דעתו? Why should I decide differently because of the Rambam? ועוד כי יש דברים שהגאונים חולקים על זה, וזה המחבר בברר דברי האחד וכתבם בחיבורו, ולמה אסמוך אני על ברירתו. And says the Ravid also, sometimes the Geonim disagreed amongst themselves. One Gaon said one thing, the other said another. And the Rambam decides like one, not the other. Says the Ravid, fine. The Rambam thinks that this Gaon is right, this is wrong. It's his prerogative. He could think that. But what if I think the other way around? I think this Gaon is right, not this one. Why do I need to bow down to the Rambam? His decision, I don't agree with. This is a very harsh statement to say, but basically what he's saying is Rambam is arrogant. That is what he's right. He has within him more wind than he should have. That's basically what the phrase means. So the Ravid doesn't like what the Rambam does. But at the end of the day, what happened? So the Rambam wanted to come with something together, didn't manage, but still the Rambam is one of the great chiburim. Everyone learns it. And even though it might not be a halachic authority, but it's a very important book that everyone takes into consideration when they write. So this issue, this problem of not having an authoritative center, book, body, institution is still there. So what do we do? Now the Rambam felt, and the Rambam understood, that even if his book would become an authoritative book, it would still not be enough, because a few centuries from now, things will change even more, and his book won't be enough. What do you need? You need live institutions in order to run a people, and we don't have live institutions, so what are we going to do? Here the Rambam came up with a very big chidush, very, very big chidush that not everyone agreed with, but the Rambam saw it as something that must be true, because otherwise we're not able to run our people anymore. The Rambam believed in the nitzchiyut, in the continuity of Torah. He believed that this Torah that we received in Har Sinai is the Torah that will run the people of Israel forever. And without the Torah, the existence of the people of Israel is meaningless, because we're the people of the Torah. That is our brit with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, if you tell me that I'm no longer able to interpret the Torah in a way that unifies the people, in the way that I am able to have national life in my land in Eretz Israel, then the Torah is useless. There is no real connection between the Torah and the people. The Torah is no longer a unifying force in the people. So the Rambam, therefore, believes there must be a way. What could be the way? So the Rambam gives us that way in Ilchot Sanhedrin Perek Daled Halacha Yud Aleph. He gives it to us there, and he also gives it in his Perush HaMishnayot and in other places, but this is one of the sources. Let's see it here. Nir'in li hadvarim, says the Rambam. He has no source for it, but he says, it seems to me that. Why does it seem to him that? Because it must be true. According to the Rambam, if this is not true, then there is no way of believing that the Torah is eternal. The Torah being eternal means that it goes with the Jewish people through eternity, throughout the whole of history. And if it comes to a point where you say, well, we're stuck with this broken Torah that we're no longer able to fix, then the Torah is not eternal. If we need a second revelation in order to fix the Torah, and that is what we need if we're not able to fix it ourselves, if we need Mashiach to come and fix it for us, then the Torah is not eternal. The Torah must be eternal, and that means to say that the last time that God revealed himself to us in regard to giving us law, the Torah, was in Mount Sinai. Ani ma'amin shezot haTorah lo teheh muchlefet. I believe that this Torah will not be switched for another Torah, is exactly that according to the Rambam. And therefore it means that we are able to, quote unquote, fix this Torah on our own as a people. How are we going to do it? This is what the Rambam is saying. נראים לי הדברים שאם הסכימו כל החכמים שבארץ ישראל למנות דיינים ולסמוך אותם, הרי אלו סמוכים ויש להם לדון דיני קנסות ויש להם לסמוך לאחרים. Says the Rambam, I think that if all the Chachamim in Eretz Israel agree to appoint judges and to make them, to declare them as smuchim, as ordained, then they are ordained. And they're able to do all the things that ordained dayanim are able to do, and they can then ordain others that will come after them. Now, אם כן, למה היו החכמים מצטערים על הסמיכה כדי שלא יבטלו דיני קנסות מישראל? Why, therefore, we read in the Gemara of some of the Chachamim that have real Mesirut Nefesh for the smicha, for the ordination to not stop. Says the Rambam, if we could redo it, then why were they so worried? So says the Rambam, לפי שישראל מפוזרים, ואפשר שיסכימו כולן, because we know reality. Look now, are we able to get all the Chachamim in Eretz Israel to agree on the smicha, on the chidush smicha? We're not able to, because we're scattered all over, we're dispersed. So the Chachamim knew that would happen, and so they didn't want it to end, because if it doesn't end, לפי שישראל מפוזרים ואי אפשר שיסכימו כולם. ואם היה שם סמוך מפי סמוך, if there are already still ordained people of previous generations, אינו צריך דעת כולן. He wouldn't need everyone's agreement if he is already ordained. So, and he's able to ordain others. So, in other words, the Rambam says that our problem was that it stopped, and now in order to renew it, we need everyone to agree. So this is a great novelty of the Rambam. Not everyone agreed with it, but most, throughout the generations, most rabbis seem to have agreed with it. There are a few that wrote against this idea, but most have seemed to agree with it. And throughout the generations, there were attempts to redo the smicha. And okay, so there were attempts to redo the smicha. One of these attempts, the famous one, was 500 years ago in the year 1538, Shnat Ratzach, where Mahari Beirav was ordained in Tzfat. he took all his students and other rabbis that were in Tzfat, 25 in number, great rabbis, all of them, and they agreed. They said, well, where are the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael? Tzfat was then the Torah center of Eretz Yisrael, and they said, let's start the smicha again. Now, why did they do it? For quite an esoteric reason. The reason was that at that time, there were anusim that were coming back to Judaism, people that in the past they or their parents accepted Christianity. Either they were forced or they accepted it because they accepted it at the time. Now they regret and they're coming back. They left Spain, they left Portugal, they're coming back to Judaism. Some of them were in Sfat, and they felt that now they're chayav karet because they were of the Avodah Zarah. So the punishment for Avodah Zarah is death. Now, how do you atone for something like that? So there is a halacha that that if someone accepts upon themselves lashes by a beit din, that could replace karet. So they said, in order to give lashes, we need a beit din of smuchin, we need a proper beit din. So in order to have that, we need to reinstate the smicha. And therefore they said, let's do it, that we could give lashes to these anusim and save them from karet, from being cut off from the people of Israel. So that was their motivation. But at the time, there was one rabbi who was fiercely against it. That was Maharalbach, Rabbi Levi ben Chaviv, the rabbi of Yerushalayim at the time. He said, it has to be all the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael. And you left the rabbis of Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was then a center as well, not as great as Tzfat, but still a center. You left us out. And he also held that it's not so simple, that you can't really do it. Anyhow, he felt they cannot do it. However, Rabbi Yaakov Berav felt that you could do it, and he gave smicha to 4 of his disciples, which are very famous. The one I'm sure you heard about, Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, was a samuch of Rabbi Yaakov Berav. So if we hold that the smicha held, then the Shulchan Aruch holds a lot of authority just because of that. It's a work of a rabbi who was ordained by the agreement of who was ordained by a rabbi who was ordained by the agreement of the majority of the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael at the time. So that is Rabbi Yosef Karo. The second was Rabbi Moshe Mitirani, the Mabit, the Remak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and Rabbi Yosef Sagis. So these 4 Talmidim now there are some traditions that Rabbi Yosef Karo continued and ordained some of his Talmidim as well. But whether it happened or not and what exactly he thought of it, it's not so clear. But that is the end of that story. Now we have to end, so I'll just end with saying that there were a few other attempts throughout history. The last one was at the beginning of the 2000s. I don't know if you know, there was an attempt to reinstate the Sanhedrin. Rav Steinsaltz was involved in it, but then he left because it was a group of it was quite of a strange group that tried to do it. Other than Rav Steinsaltz, they were all strange people. But that was the last attempt. It was before that in 1950 of Rav Maimon. But the idea of these people was that if we want to reinstate religious life and to make it serious, we need to reinstate our halachic institutions and make them serious, to give them real power in the eyes of the people. And in order to do that, they have to have real powers, first of all, in the eyes of halakha. So we have to have institutions that are able to legislate to the people, and institutions that are really able to make real halachic decisions, not just to look in the books and interpret and try, and because obviously we have this real rejuvenation of the Jewish people in so many ways, but not in the way of halakha, we're still, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, we're still in decline. If we even take halakha's state to what it is now, to when we compare it to 100 or 200 years ago, it's the authority of his institutions today are less than they were then. If there were two people in the shtetl who were who were arguing with each other, they knew that they go to the rabbi for a din Torah. Today, they know they go to court. It's very rare that people would go to a beit din, and when they go to a beit din, it's not because they have to; it's because they want to. So, no beit din has a real authority over people nowhere in the world today, and so that is something to think about. Um, so, this was the last meeting, and I feel that I'm finishing it in the middle. I would have needed another meeting to finish this to finish it up, but maybe I'll do it on another opportunity. But we'll leave things the way they are now and pray and daven to Hashem that Be'ezrat Hashem, one day things will that not Hashem, but we need to, as the Rambam says, we need to get our act together and not only build our state, but rebuild our Torah as well, that it would fit us as a nation, not only as individuals and sporadic communities. Be'ezrat Hashem, one day, b'mehera v'yameinu.
Thank you.
Amen.
Amen. Pleasure. So we'll stop now, and at 12 o'clock, we'll reconvene at Rabbi Professor Jeffrey's Shiur.
Okay.
Rabbi, can I have a question?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, please.
When, assuming the Sanhedrin will be reenacted, what power will they have? I mean, can they go and change, let's say, the 39 melachot of Shabbat to be one melacha, only lighting fire? Can they change, like what kind of changes can they do? Or is it very minor, small changes, the halacha that they can change?
Yes. So that's a very good question. They're not able to change Dinei Deoraita, but they are able to change, under certain conditions, the understanding of halachot deoraita. Meaning they could say the meaning of the pasuk is actually this, not that. But let's say if we have a tradition that there are 39 melachot, they cannot all of a sudden say, no, there is only one melacha. That they cannot do. But they could institute new laws, new takanot. They could take away other takanot that they think no longer fit the people. So they have quite a lot of power, because a lot of the halachot, as we keep it, so much of it are takanot and gzeirot, etc. So at the end of the day, a Sanhedrin does have a lot of power. Whether or not a Sanhedrin would want to execute his power in a radical way, probably not. Like any responsible institution, it would do so moderately, but it would still have the power.
No, but I'll give it. I'll give you an example. I take the issue of tefillin. Okay.
Of what?
I learned tefillin, when we put on tefillin in the morning.
Yes.
Tefillin. I learned recently that it wasn't always practiced every day by Jews throughout. And then there's even in the Talmud that they say you don't have to put it on every day. Okay? So, I mean, could they change, let's say, to come and say, we now make halacha, you put on tefillin once a month, instead of every day, or, I'm not talking about a minhag, I'm talking about actual halacha. Because
So
when you say they can only...
Theoretically, yes. The question is, meaning how, if they come and say that actually the putting it on every day is not mideoraita, they understand the deoraita as putting it on once in a while, and therefore, so they have the power. Now, generally, the way the main bonus you have with a Sanhedrin that has real power is that you have a number of chachamim saying something, a number of chachamim saying other things. You take a vote and you make a decision that binds everyone that is here. Like, you won't have different opinions. You won't, oh, they say you could do this, they say you could do that. No, you take a vote and decide what is going to be done. Is it going to be this way or that way? You take things to a vote and you make decisions.
Right. And then it's binding.
And then it's binding. Yes, that's the whole idea of
No, I thought about, for instance, this whole drasha of that a woman cannot testify, or cannot be a dayan,
yes.
Right? And you think about it, and it doesn't look such a very strong drasha. Maybe rabbis
so
at that time felt that that's
if they
what
feel they could do another drasha, then they have the authority. Yes.
From now on, a woman could be a judge.
Right.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Okay, pleasure. So we'll reconvene in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Rav Hanan.
Thank you.